And it's the 4th of July. Or, arguably the whole weekend is the 4th of July these days. In fact, the whole week, it seems. But I wanted to talk about the original Brexit, right? The first break with Great Britain, and how it came about. Because there's a lot of mythology around this. There's a lot of bad history being taught in our schools. Those of you who are longtime listeners to this program already know this story. Those of you who've read my book, the Unequal Protection: The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights, know this story because it's a chapter out of the book, actually. And you can. By the way, you can read it online for free over at truthout.org, the entire book. But I just wanted to share with you, how America became independent. July 4th, 1776 was the day that it literally wasn't the day that the Declaration was signed, but it was the day that I believe the last signature was affixed to it. But in any case, it's the day that we honor as the day that the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, edited by John Jay and Ben Franklin and John Adams. But 95% Thomas Jefferson. The day that document was ratified, was signed, the day that those, as I recall, as 57 men became traitors to England and all had bounties put on their heads. So how'd this come about? It turns out, the story that I heard when I was in school, when I was a little kid, the story that I heard was that the thing that really flipped everybody was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Prior to the Boston Tea Party, Thomas Jefferson had written a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British Americans, which was basically how to be a good British subject while living on the North American continent. And it was, talking about some of the things that, the British America, some of the rights that British Americans had and should have, and that sort of thing. But it wasn't talking about separating from England. And then there was a very substantial economic downturn, particularly in Europe. Not so much here, but particularly in Europe in 1770. 1770, 1771, 1772, 1773. These were basically major recession, minor depression years in the UK. And the largest corporation in England was the British East India Company, and that corporation was really struggling. They were having a tough time because of this recession. And the principal stockholders in the British East India Company were the members of Parliament. In fact, in its earliest days, it was founded on December 31st, 1601. The original corporate charter was signed by Queen Elizabeth and the Virgin Queen. And thus, when the East India Company started Jamestown and established Virginia, they named the state of Virginia after the Virgin Queen in whatever the year was, 1607, as I recall. So anyhow, by 1773, this recession was getting really bad, and the Boston and the East India Company was struggling, and all of these members of Parliament were stockholders. So they all got together and they said, we got to do something. Now, I learned this from the only book that has been published that is an actual first-person account of the Boston Tea Party, because everybody there swore themselves and everybody else to secrecy. And this was titled, and I actually found an original copy of this. I have it carefully stored away right now. Actually, it's on our boat. It's not so carefully stored away, but I still have it. And it's titled A Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party, with a memoir by George R.T. Hughes, a survivor of the little band of patriots who drowned the tea in Boston Harbor in 1773. That's the title. It's published by S.S. Bliss in 1834 in New York, because George George R.T. Hughes was the only person who broke the silence because he was only 17 years old when it happened. And by the time he was an old man, everybody else was dead, and that was the deal. When everybody's dead, somebody can write the story, and George Hughes wrote the story. And this is literally the only first-person account that exists. He notes that many American colonists either boycotted the purchase of tea or were smuggling or purchasing smuggling tea to avoid supporting the East India Company's profits. And I quote from his book. He said, rendering the smuggling of tea an object and was frequently practiced, and the resolutions against using it. In other words, the colonists were committed to, the East India Company was trying to pull a Walmart. They were trying to put all these small independent tea shops up and down the East Coast out of business. And in 1773, the response to the recession of the British Parliament was to cut the tax on tea for the East India Company so they could undersell the British colonists. Meanwhile, Hughes writes, an immense quantity of tea was accumulating in the warehouses of had accumulated in the warehouses of the East India Company in England. This company petitioned the king to suppress the duty of 3 pence per pound upon its introduction into America. So there used to be an export tax of 3 cents a pound, and that was what the Tea Act of 1773 did away with. It was a tax break for the East India Company. The petition was successful, produced the Tea Act of 1773. Back to Hughes, quoting him, the East India Company, however, received permission to transport tea free of all duty from Great Britain to America, allowing it to wipe out its small competitors and take over the tea business in all of America. Hence, it was no longer the small vessels of private merchants who went to vend tea for their own account in the ports of the colonies, but on the contrary, ships of an enormous burthen that transported immense quantities of this commodity, which by the aid of the public authority might, as they supposed, easily be landed and amassed in suitable magazines, storage places. Accordingly, the company sent its agents at Boston, New York, and Philadelphia 600 chests of tea. This is tax-free tea, right? And a proportionate number to Charleston and other maritime cities of the American continent. The colonies were now arrived at the decisive moment when they must cast the die and determine their course. So what are we going to do? We got this tea coming. What are we going to do? In Philadelphia, he writes, those to whom the tea of the East India Company were intended to be consigned were induced by persuasion or constrained by menaces to promise in no terms to accept the proffered consignment. In other words, the people went to the Philadelphia company that was supposed to receive the tea and said, don't. And they said, okay, we won't. At New York, Captain Sears McDougal, daring and enterprising men, effected a concert of will against the East India Company between the smugglers, the merchants, and the Sons of Liberty, who had all joined forces and were pretty much the same people. Pamphlets suited to the conjecture were daily distributed, and nothing was left unattempted by popular leaders to obtain their purpose. Here was one. This is one of the pamphlets that was passed out. It was signed by Rusticus. It was called The Alarm. Are we in like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who now have the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America? Their conduct, he's talking about the East India Company, their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. 1,500,000, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year alone. Not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants engulfed all the necessities of life and set them at so high a price that the poor could not purchase them. So they succeeded in turning the ships back in Philadelphia and in New York. But the ships arrived in Boston, 3 of them. And now we had a crisis. We'll be back with more of the story right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Okay, so I was telling the story, and I'll continue. I'm just, reading from George Robert. This is, we're in a time machine here. We are listening to the voice of a man who literally was there at the Boston Tea Party. He says, a guard was placed on Griffin's Wharf, near where the tea ships were moored. It was agreed that a strict watch should be kept, that if any insult should be offered, the bell should be immediately rung. Now, Rusticus, one of the pamphleteers, these were the bloggers of their day, added his voice. This was a pamphlet that said, quote, resolve, therefore, nobly resolve, and publish to the world your resolutions, that no man will receive the tea, no man will let his stores, or suffer the vessel that brings it to moor at his wharf, and that if any person assists at unloading, landing, or storing it, he shall ever after be deemed an enemy to his country and never be employed by his fellow citizens. These people were seriously bent out of shape about this, the largest corporation in the world trying to mess with the economics and the politics of the colonies. Rusticus wrote another pamphlet. This is October 27, 1773. It hath now been proved to you that the East India Company obtained that monopoly of that trade by bribery and corruption, that the power thus obtained they have prostituted to extortion and other the most cruel and horrible purposes the sun ever beheld. These people were really seriously PO'd at this corporation. George Robert Twelvetree Hughes writes, on the 28th of November, 1773, the ship Dartmouth with 112 chests arrived. The next morning after, the following notice was widely circulated. Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea, has arrived in this harbor. The hour of destruction, a manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself, and to posterity is now called upon to meet in Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock this day, at which time the bells will ring to make a united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive measure of administration. He writes, and again, I'm quoting from George Robert Twelvetree Hughes, who, by the way, was friends with George Washington and joined the army with Paul Revere. Literally, he and Paul Revere joined the army together. The people of the country arrived in great numbers, he writes. The inhabitants of the town assembled. This assembly, which was on the 16th of December, 1773, was the most numerous ever known, there being more than 2,000 from the countryside present. Then it was resolved that the tea should be returned to the place from whence it came in all events. The arrival of other cargoes of tea soon after increased the agitation in the public mind, already wrought up to a degree of desperation and ready to break out into acts of violence on every trivial occasion of offense. At 5 o'clock, a vote was called for the dissolution of the meeting and obtained. So, in other words, they got together and they just all, I'm deleting large parts of his narrative of what happened in the meeting and who spoke and what they said, just for time purposes. And then he says, at the very end of the meeting, Josiah Quinney, a man of great influence in the colony, after demanding silence, said, greatly will he deceive himself who shall think that with cries, with exclamations, with popular resolutions, we can hope to triumph in the conflict and vanquish our inveterate foes. Their malignity is implacable, their thirst for vengeance insatiable. Right? In other words, he's saying, if you think just demonstrating, yelling, publishing newspapers is going to do it, sorry, it's going to take direct action. And then he says, reflect and ponder, even ponder well, before you embrace these measures, which are to involve this country in the most perilous enterprise the world has ever witnessed. So in other words, they knew they were on the edge by taking on the East India Company, and thus by proxy the British government. They realized they were on the edge of a huge Brexit. The question was then immediately put whether the landing of the tea should be opposed and carried in the affirmative unanimously. It is related, a person disguised after the manner of the Indians who was in the gallery shouted at this juncture the cry of war, and the meeting dissolved in the twinkling of the eye, and the multitude rushed in a mass to Griffin's Wharf. That's where the tea was, right? Hughes writes, it was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet, which I and my associates denominated the tomahawk, and with which, and a club, after having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of our blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street after thus being described, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me, and marched in order to the place of our destination. When we arrived at the wharf, there were 3 or 4 of our number who assumed an authority to direct our operations, to which we readily submitted. They divided us into 3 parties for the purposes of boarding the 3 ships which contained the tea. The name of him who commanded the division to which I was assigned was Leonard Pitt. The names of the other commanders I never knew. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied and delivered the articles and requested me to do no damage to his ship or rigging. We were then ordered by the commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately executed his orders, first cutting and spilling the chests with our tomahawks so as to thoroughly expose them to the effects of the water. Then he talks about, we then quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other or taking any measures to even discover who were our associates. Nor do I recollect of our having had the knowledge of the name of a single individual concerned in this affair, except of Leonard Pitt, who I mentioned. So in fact, he says this was the quietest night in Boston.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Okay, so George Robert 12-Tree Hughes is retiring to their several places of residence, and they don't even know who each other are, right? The entire Boston Tea Party was done in complete silence. He said there appeared to be an understanding that each individual should volunteer his services, keep his own secret, and risk the consequences for himself. No disorder took place during that transaction, and it was observed at that time that the stillest night ensued that Boston had enjoyed for many months. The participants were absolutely committed that none of the East India Company's tea would ever be consumed on our shores. Hughes writes, during the time we were throwing the tea overboard, there were several attempts made by some of the citizens of Boston and its vicinity to carry off small quantities of it for their family use. To effect that object, they would watch their opportunity to snatch up a handful from the deck, where it became plentifully scattered, and put it in their pockets. One Captain O'Connor, whom I knew well, came on board for that purpose, and when he supposed he was not noticed, filled his pockets and also the lining of his coat. But I had detected him and gave information to the captain of what I was doing. We were ordered to take him into custody, and just as he was stepping off the vessel, I seized him by the skirt of his coat, and in attempting to pull him back, I tore it off. But springing forward by a rapid effort, he made his escape. He had, however, to run a gauntlet through the crowd upon the wharf, upon Wharf 9, each one as he passed, giving him a kick or a stroke. Another attempt was made to save a little tea from the ruins of the cargo by a tall, aged man who wore a large cocked hat and white wig, which was fashionable at that time. He had slipped a little into his pocket, but being detected, they seized him and, taking his hat and wig from his head, threw them, together with the tea, of which they had emptied his pockets, into the water. In consideration of his advanced age, he was permitted to escape, with now and then just a slight kick. The next morning, George Robert 12-Tree Hughes writes, the next morning, after we cleared the ships of the tea, it was discovered that very considerable quantities of the tea were still floating upon the surface of the water. And to prevent the possibility of any of its being saved for use, a number of small boats were manned by sailors and citizens who rowed them into those parts of the harbor wherever the tea was visible, and by beating it with oars and paddles, so thoroughly drenched it as to render its entire destruction inevitable. Hughes noted that 342 chests of tea, 90,000 pounds, were thrown overboard that night, enough to make 24 million cups of tea. It was valued by the British East India Company at 9,659 pounds sterling, which today would be $1 million. So the British response to this, which came a month or two later, was to pass the Boston Port Act, which said that no American ships can enter or leave the port of Boston, which was, arguably the one of the three largest commercial ports in the United States. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were the big one, or Charleston, excuse me, were the big ones. The Boston Ports Act said that until Boston, the city of Boston, repaid the East India Company $1 million for the tea that George Hughes and his buddies destroyed, that there could be no commerce in Boston. The colonists refused. A year and a half later, the colonists, still refusing to reimburse the corporation, again openly stated their defiance of the East India Company and Great Britain by taking on British troops in an armed conflict at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. We refer to that now as the shot heard round the world. And this was, really the initiation of the American Revolution. It was after the Boston Tea Party that Thomas Jefferson stopped talking about how to be a good British citizen and started talking about independence. So it all started with a revolt against corporate power.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.